Welcome to the July 26th edition of Growth Groups Online at FBC Watauga. We are still going through the Gospel Project's Volume 8, Jesus the Servant, and we are currently on Unit 23, Jesus the Teacher. This week is Session 4. 2 more weeks to go in this unit entitled Jesus as Teacher. He has taught us about actions, attitudes, and commitment required to be a disciple. And then last week we learned about the spiritual discipline of prayer. This week our focus is treasure, one of the most important topics in the Bible. We are in Luke chapter 12 this morning, starting in verse 13, and point 1 is called Be Rich Toward God. Let's check out verses 13 through 15 to get the context of the parable that we're going to be looking at this morning. Someone from the crowd said to him, "Teacher, tell my brother to divide the inheritance with me." "Friend," he said to him, "who appointed me a judge or arbitrator over you?" He then told them, "Watch out and be on your guard against all greed, because one's life is not in the abundance of his possessions." And verses 13 through 15 are again telling us the context before he shares the parable. It was very common in Israel during this time for a citizen to ask a rabbi to settle a dispute. But what's odd here is that immediately preceding this passage, Jesus has been talking about acknowledging the Son of Man before others, a completely different topic that this man has on his mind when he interrupts Jesus here in verse 13. This man was clearly distracted from the message that Jesus had for him by this particular circumstance in his life. Now, the situation itself is about dividing an inheritance. Typically during this time, the oldest son received 2/3 of the inheritance and the younger son received 1/3. Now, we really don't know what the plan was to divide the inheritance in this particular case, but we do know that Jesus refused to get involved in this family matter and instead, in verse 15, warns them about greed. That phrase, "be on your guard against all greed," implies that we are under attack in this area and we must protect our hearts and our minds from this particular temptation. So what is greed? It's simply the desire to have more, a lot like the word coveting that we see in the Old Testament. Because greed is all about more, it can never get enough. If they really both were greedy, no solution that Jesus proposed would have been satisfactory to either party. And so Jesus instead warns them about greed and tells them this parable. There's a couple of repeated words in here. I want you to see if you can hear them as I read through the parable. He told them this parable. "A rich man's land was very productive. He thought to himself, 'What should I do, since I don't have anywhere to store my crops?' 'I will do this,' he said. 'I'll tear down my barns and build bigger ones and store all my grain and my goods there. Then I'll say to myself, you have many goods stored up for many years. Take it easy. Eat, drink, and enjoy yourself.' But God said to him, 'You fool, this very night your life is demanded of you, and the things you have prepared, whose will they be?' That is how it is with the one who stores up treasure for himself and is not rich toward God." So here's the stage. A man's land has been very productive, apparently unusually so because his barns won't even hold everything. So he has come into a lot of wealth. Did you catch the 2 repeated words in this parable? They are I/my and the word store, S-T-O-R-E. These words give us an insight into this man's thinking. In his mind, this was his wealth from his hard work, and he needs to store it all up for his own personal use. Sounds like a pretty typical American view. But look at how Jesus ends the parable. He calls the man a fool because that very night his life would be over. You see, this man wasn't thinking about James 4:14. Yet you do not know what tomorrow will bring, what your life will be, for you are like a vapor that appears for a little while and then vanishes. You see, none of the wealth that he had could provide for his eternity. He couldn't take anything with him. In verse 21, we learn the lesson of the parable. That is how it is with the one who stores up treasure for himself and is not rich toward God. So how are we rich toward God? Well, first, we are instructed to be different than the world. So yes, we still work hard for what we have, but we remember that ultimately, it was God who equipped us for the work that we do, and it was God who provided for us the job that we have. So everything we have as a result of that job really comes from God. So that money that we earn is a gift from God to be used for His purposes and His glory. That money is not just there for our own personal enjoyment, and certainly not there to tempt us to be greedy. It is there to provide for our needs, for the needs of the church, and to help others who have needs. The other part of being rich toward God is to trust in God for provision. Sometimes jobs go away, your health changes, your family situation changes, but God's love for you and His desire to provide for you don't change. Paul says it best in Philippians 4, where he says, "I have learned to be content in whatever circumstances I find myself. I am able to do all things through Christ who strengthens me." I had a friend that posted a great quote on Facebook this morning that I wanted to share with you that directly connects with this. It says, "Wise advice I was given yesterday. Stop worrying. God always provides all that is needed. Sometimes He doesn't give it directly to the one with the need. So if we have more than we need of something, money, time, encouragement, then it is our job to look around and figure out whose provision we are holding and find a way to give it to them." Isn't that a great quote? What a wonderful outlook to carry with us through days of need and days of more than enough. So let's take just a second and pause this video and look at a couple of questions that I have for you guys, and I will see you back here for point 2. So in the first point, in this first parable we looked at, we really looked at the idea of being rich toward God and not storing up all of our treasures for our own personal use, but remembering where they come from and looking for people who may have need. We're going to continue on in Luke chapter 12 and remember that we need to trust in God's faithful provision and beware of worry. And that's what point 2 is going to be all about. Let's take a look at what these verses say. Then He said to His disciples, "Therefore, I tell you, don't worry about your life, what you will eat, or the body, what you will wear. For life is more than food, and the body more than clothing. Consider the ravens. They don't sow or reap. They don't have a storeroom or a barn, and yet God feeds them. Aren't you worth much more than the birds? Can any of you add 1 moment to your lifespan by worrying? If then you are not able to do even a little thing, why worry about the rest? Consider how the wildflowers grow. They don't labor or spin thread. Yet I tell you, not even Solomon in all his splendor was adorned like one of these. If that's how God clothes the grass, which is in the field today and is thrown into the furnace tomorrow, how much more will He do for you, you of little faith? Don't strive for what you should eat and what you should drink, and don't be anxious, for the Gentile world eagerly seeks after all these things, and your Father knows that you need them." Did you catch that phrase, much more, that's in there a couple of times? We're going to talk about that as we go through this passage. Jesus has moved from a parable about greed to a parable about worry. What's the connection, you ask? Greed can never get enough, and worry never has enough. Both of these things are connected to our attitude toward, well, things. Jesus tells us not to worry about our life, what we will eat, or our bodies, what we will wear. And then He uses 2 examples from nature to help Him make this point: birds and flowers. I don't know if you can hear the birds in the background today, but there are a lot of birds in the vicinity of my backyard this afternoon. And He says ravens do not plant fields, they do not collect a harvest, and they do not have barns, and yet God feeds them. Now, does a bird still have to go and find the food that God provides? Yes. Ravens have to go collect the food they need for each day, much like the Israelites collected manna in the wilderness. Jesus concludes basically saying, aren't you, as a human, worth much more than the birds? So how much more will God then take care of you? You are valuable to God. And then Jesus connects worrying essentially to a low understanding of our own value to God. He wants us to remember that we are valuable to God, we matter to God, and He's going to take care of us much more than He even takes care of the birds. Jesus then reminds us that worrying does not add 1 moment to our lifespan. In fact, studies have shown just the opposite. Excessive worry can actually shorten our lifespans because worry is very bad for our health. The second example that we see here is wildflowers. Springtime in Texas means wildflowers along our highways. The displays are so spectacular, we drive to see them and even take photos of them. Those flowers didn't labor or spin to create the brilliant colors they wear for such a short time in the spring. And that is precisely what God made them to do. How much more will He do for us? And then Jesus connects worrying with being one of little faith. So worry is an issue of how we see ourselves and how we see God, and a lack of faith. Verse 29 has 2 important commands. The first one is, do not strive for what you should eat or drink. The Gentiles eagerly seek after these things. The Greek word for both strive and seek in these verses is the same word that we see in Matthew 6:33 and Luke 12:31, where Jesus says to seek first His kingdom and His righteousness. So this warning is simply about where our focus should be, not on food, but seeking after God's kingdom first and foremost. The second instruction is do not be anxious. Now, the Greek word for anxious also carries a much deeper meaning. Torn about is what it said in my commentary this week. If you can imagine a ship being tossed about in the waves in the middle of a storm, that is exactly what anxiety can feel like, right? Well, that's why Hebrews 6:19 describes the hope we have as an anchor for the soul. Anchors keep ships firmly and securely in port. Jesus is our anchor that keeps us when our minds want to be anxious. Worry comes very naturally for many of us, me included. So let me share something interesting that I found this week. The antonyms for worry are certainty, peace, joy, and trust. And the antonyms for fear or anxiety are faith, trust, courage, and confidence. Do you see some fruit of the spirits on these lists? So, as the Holy Spirit works His transformational power in our hearts and our minds, we will be able to let go of worry, let go of fear and anxiety, and trust God more. And I can tell you, I've seen this in my own life. So let's take just a second here and pause the video and look at a couple of questions, and I will see you back here for point 3. In point 3, we are continuing through Luke chapter 12, picking up where we left off in verse 31. And this point is seek God's kingdom first. The verses read, "But seek His kingdom, and these things will be provided for you. Don't be afraid, little flock, because your Father delights to give you the kingdom. Sell your possessions and give to the poor. Make money bags for yourselves that don't grow old, an inexhaustible treasure in heaven where no thief comes near and no moth destroys. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. So we just talked about how we are not supposed to strive for food and clothes. Instead, we are supposed to strive for his kingdom, as it says in verse 31, but seek his kingdom, and these things will be provided for you. And he tells them not to be afraid. In other words, be courageous, be confident, be calm, and trust God. The Father delights to give you the kingdom. What does this mean? Well, as adopted sons and daughters, we enjoy the benefits of membership in God's kingdom, ultimately eternity in heaven, as well as a relationship with our loving Heavenly Father here and now, who graciously provides for our needs. But this also leaves us with responsibility for his kingdom, as his ambassadors to the world while we are here, telling others of the good news and passing his gospel message on to the next generation. Being given the kingdom has both benefits and responsibilities. Now he goes on and encourages them to sell your possessions and give to the poor, and to make money bags for yourselves that won't grow old, inexhaustible treasures in heaven. Those are perhaps some of the responsibilities, and just a reminder to us that God has always blessed us for a purpose. Where your treasure is, there your heart will be also, is kind of how he wraps things up here. Warren Wiersbe tells us that we must look at earth from heaven's point of view and make sure that we put God's kingdom first in everything. The main question is, where is your heart? If our hearts are fixed on transient things, we will always worry. But if we are fixed on the eternal, then God's peace will guard our minds and our hearts. They will anchor us when it feels like we're being tossed about by the storms of this life. We must hang loose when it comes to this world's goods and be willing even to sell what we have in order to help others. That's what seeking God's kingdom first means. Let's take a second and pause the video and look at a couple of questions, and I'll come back here and wrap things up for you guys. Today, we looked at treasures. Wealth can leave us worried and anxious. Wealth can also easily lead us to greed. It is not wrong to own things, so long as we don't allow the things to own us and lead us down a path to sin. This is a fine line to walk, especially in our culture, but it is one of the lifestyle patterns that sets us apart from the world. John Wesley said it this way: earn as much as you can, save as much as you can, and give as much as you can. Words of wisdom for all of us. So I'm going to leave you guys with some family conversation questions, as I always do, as well as a family challenge to look at for this week. And I hope you guys have a blessed week.